Good morning. Isn't Jesus wonderful? So, Christmas is over. I feel like I went too fast. In a few days, we'll be celebrating a new year. 2 more days from now, and it will be 2025. I remember when that sounded so far in the future. 2025. I remember Marty McFly once traveled back in time in a DeLorean to the far distant future of 2024, right? And that is 2 days from being over. Does anybody have any big plans? Parties, get-togethers? Oh, okay. Most of the people are like, no, I just had family over. Why on God's green earth would I do that again? It's true. That works. I remember being young enough, I had to convince my parents to let me stay up. And now I feel like I'm forced to stay up. Anybody have any new resolutions this year? About 45% of Americans have them every year. They are something that go in one year and out the other. Usually the second Friday in January is when people give up on them. So they last all of about a week, on average. It isn't quite as big a holiday as Christmas, is it? Only about 54% of people plan on doing anything out that night. 24% plan to celebrate at home by themselves. There are about 128 million people planning to travel to their parties. I think that's the part that worries me when you combine that with the 360 plus million glasses of champagne that will be consumed that evening. Maybe driving's not the smart move. It's considered America's most drunk holiday, which surprises me compared to St. Patrick's Day, 4th of July. I don't blame people for staying home, though. The average cost of a babysitter for New Year's Eve is $40 per hour. So 48% of parents plan to just do this at home. And they actually plan to count down early with their children. I noticed several years back there are apps for this and there's different videos on different streaming things. So they use popular cartoon characters, and then they count down early for your kids. So by 9, they can be in bed, and you guys can go to a party or something. But about 50% plan to kiss somebody when the ball drops, which includes me if my wife says so. It is pushed as such a tradition to kiss someone that the stat seems a little low to me. You watch TV and they have the New Year's episode, and that's the big thing. But it is 50% who plan on kissing someone, so I guess there's room for it to be higher. So I told you this week we'd be back in Revelation 6. I lied. No, we are about to start a new year, so we'll get into this new chapter. We'll get into more of the meat of the tribulation, so to speak. We discussed how the divine outline is found in chapter 1, verse 19. Therefore, write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will take place hereafter. Metatauta. The things which were, the vision John had of Jesus and him being on the island. The things which are, the letters to the congregations, 7 letters, and which is actually the entire history of the church, and it shifts and changes. And the things which will be hereafter, metatauta, is found at the beginning of chapter 4. These things are hereafter this. And this is when we see the 24 elders in heaven, the title deed, the unsealing of it, everything we think of as traditional tribulation details. It's a judgment poured out on mankind. As we saw in Romans 5, 6 through 11, while we were still helpless, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one will hardly die for a righteous man, though perhaps for the good man someone would dare even die. But God demonstrates his love towards us, you can quote it along if you remember it, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through him. For a while, if we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son. Much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And not only this, but we also exult in God through Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we now receive the reconciliation. We are saved from the wrath of God by the blood of Jesus. The Bible tells us this. And the tribulation, or time of Jacob's trouble, because of its focus on Israel, is a time God pouring out his wrath on the world. We went over this a couple weeks ago. We saw that this is called the time of God's wrath, or his pouring out of his wrath, in Revelation 6:17, 10:7, 11:18, 15:1, 16:1, and 16:17. God saved us from his wrath. He bought us with his blood. He will not put us through this. Some would try to reference Israel in Egypt, where they went through it, but they were spared. And again, the focus was on Israel. Israel went through this. It has nothing to do with the church, although I could cite Jethro, a priest of God who was nowhere near it the entire time, until afterwards. Some would point to the flood. Noah went through it. It was a judgment on the whole world. They went through it. Yes, they represent Israel, but notice Enoch, who preached salvation beforehand, was literally raptured out before this occurred. There are plenty of precedent, plus the fact that it's a well-taught concept for centuries, as we've gone over. So after this removal of his blood-bought and blood-paid-for bride, we in heaven, represented by the elders, have what's called a Bema Seat judgment. I have a chart. We're talking timelines. So the harpazo, which is the rapture, and we're up there with Bema Seat and a 7-year marriage supper. Okay. Meanwhile, on earth, all this stuff is happening, as I always see it portrayed. Sometimes not. Sometimes we're the victims of our own media, aren't we? We grow up seeing something so often, it's just the way it goes. And we don't even think about it. You watch the 10 Commandments too many times, and you think that's the story of Moses. And then you're like, oh, no, it's not. Never mind. But it's just the way you've heard it over and over again. We did that this last week before Christmas. Not the Bible, but I read to my kids A Christmas Carol, the book. And you've watched the movie so many times you don't realize how often they get it wrong. And then you read the book and you're like, oh wow, it's quite different. Just an example. So where we are in this study is the beginning of the 7 years. Mankind would have us ignore these events. Mankind wants us to think things are going to get better, while God warns us they will get much worse. Mankind works for peace on all the nations, saying it's close at hand. May try to unite the governments in an attempt to do this. Well, God tells us that there are wars and rumors of wars till the end. Mankind works to win against famine, disease, hardship, many of which are caused by so-called medicines and laws. But God tells us that those things will increase. Surprise, surprise, God is constantly proven right. So as we embark on this, we see that it's written this way, and it might be challenging at times to grasp, perfectly unlockable most of the times through the Old Testament, unless God specifies otherwise to John, and you'll see those. And we will see evidence of a special encoding in this book, and sometimes that can throw people. It makes the message timeless. So there's some repetition in the book. It's put that way on purpose. The Bible is designed in anticipation of enemy interference, as if God knew people would try to alter it and edit it and remove parts or come up with new books. And so it's designed in a repetitive way that Jesus is in every book. He's in every chapter, because the story of the Messiah will come through, and the gospel will shine through the entire time. So, let's start in chapter 6. Here we start the so-called 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Starting in verse 1. When I saw when the Lamb broke one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice of thunder, "Come." That's as far as we're getting this week. You're dismissed. No, I'm kidding. So, some people reacted with zero surprise there because they're like, no, that's Stephen. That's as far as we're getting. We see the word come, or erkamai, which means follow me. It's in the middle voice of primary verb. You didn't even know that existed, did you? They didn't cover that in English class. It is used to tell someone to come from one place to another. It means come up to where I am. We saw this earlier when the door was opened for John and the voice said come. Come up to where I am. Come from where you are to where I am, indicating two different places. And you'll notice when the talk is focused on heaven, the elders speak. They explain it. When it's about earth, there's no one there whose home is earth. So the living creatures talk about it, and they explain it. So here they're explaining this. So keep moving on, verse 2. I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. Now here we start this set of off-quoted set of riders and horses of various colors and purposes. Horses are usually always used in the Bible of judgment. We see that in 2 Kings 6, 15 through 18, Jeremiah 46, 9 through 10, Joel 2, 3 through 11, Nahum 3, 1 through 7, Zechariah 1, 18 through 11, 6, 1 through 7, and on and on. So this is a white horse. It's a rider. Many people think this is Jesus. It makes us think of Jesus because it's a white horse, and he conquers. He must be the Messiah. He precedes the other horses. But let's look at the differences here. The crown that this guy is wearing, it says he comes with a crown. The crown is a diadem. Is not the diadem, not the diadem, which is the king's crown, the ruler's crown, which is what Jesus wears when he returns. Here, it's the Stephanos, which is the victor's crown, the conqueror's crown. You may still, it still sounds a little like Jesus because he does this. That's the idea. The idea is it sounds like Jesus to anyone who doesn't know Jesus. John would have just said, what? Then I saw the Lamb, or then I saw the Messiah on a white horse. He would have recognized him, but that's not the case. He would have used a Jewish title at this point. This guy is set up and meant to fool as many as possible. And many commentators fall into this. This guy is meant to resemble Jesus. So the people will be fooled into thinking this is the Messiah. The Jews will fall for it. The Muslims will fall for it. Can you imagine one dude that both of those groups fall for? I mean, in the current climate or any climate we've ever known, one dude they both are all for, that they would be in agreement with? This guy holds what? A sword? No. Jesus holds a sword, as we see in Revelation 1 and 19. This guy has a bow using arrows or darts instead of a sword. And some might think this could be, some people have mentioned that they believe the Antichrist is a return of Nimrod, or in like to Nimrod. And you could use this as a reference to that because he was this hunter before the Lord. He was actually a hunter in rebellion to the Lord. And so he had a bow. It's a mark of hunter. And you'd be surprised how many secular groups and people look for him. You'd be surprised how many secular, or you consider secular or even pagan groups, look for this Antichrist and have him by a different name. And how many of them actually do believe it's Nimrod. The bow can be a symbol of hunter, so they have that. However, it gets confusing because this is the same Greek word that they used for rainbow. Now, we could tear into that one, the use of the rainbow to achieve his aims, push peace. He'll use it to mislead many, to conquer. The rainbow was a symbol that groups would understand, Jews and Muslims would understand as a symbol of God's covenant because they both know Noah. They would see it as a covenant, so that might help unite them. He uses the same symbology they understand. It will appeal to them both and give them an image of peace. But let's look. Daniel, the prophet, tells us in his book, chapter 8, verse 25, and through his policy he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the Prince of Princes. Who's that? Jesus. But he shall be broken without hand. Then Daniel 9:27, which we've looked at before, the prophet tells us, and he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Peace. And in the middle of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation, and that determined, or that same person, will have desolation poured upon him. His proposed peace is how he wins and conquers. He does not conquer by force. He conquers because everybody likes him. He conquers because he gets everybody to agree and everybody to go along with it. Do you know anyone that can do this? You can point to whoever you want, but right now, everyone is as divisive as they are liked. You will find just as many people who hate anybody as you do who likes them. But to get all those groups to like each other, that's a unique thing. This guy can do that. He pulls off a peace no one does. He conquers through diplomacy. He makes deals. He unites people under a banner. We see how society has used the rainbow for their own purposes, albeit a varied one. It's not the true rainbow. It's not how God designed it, and it could appeal to certain groups and political parties, and how people would jump to support a man showing this. We could see that, if you're honest. Moving on, verse 3 and 4. When he broke the second seal, I heard the living creature saying, "Come." And another, a red horse, went out. And to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from earth, and that men would slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. So immediately we see this peace as an illusion. He uses peace, but what comes right after him? War. So this peace doesn't last long, which we know. That was already set up, because halfway through he breaks his covenant. We will war because it's in our nature. That's what humans do. It doesn't take much. Most of our technological advancements are simply for war. They're funded by the government, or they're a deal with the government, because why? They can turn them into a weapon somehow. They'll use them for the military somehow, so they get extra funding. It's been said all the tech we have is at least 20 years old because the government had it first. Why? War. We've got to stay one step ahead. Especially after World War II, we got to stay ahead. So you never know what we really have. But humans will fight because humans fight. It's what we do. The concept of peace is elusive because humans don't want it. Movies have even made this point. We put you in peace, and The Matrix talks about that, where they created a situation that was all peaceful and humans rebelled. They knew something was wrong. Because we know life is supposed to be chaotic. It's supposed to be trouble. It's supposed to be stress. That's where we live, right? We push laws and rules under the guise of peace, security, and order, but it really only ever leads us to a loss of freedom, loss of rights, loss of voice, and more control for the ruling classes in the nations. Just look, Britain, a couple weeks ago, announced that they would be imprisoning anyone who they caught viewing what they consider far-right propaganda. And you think that sounds crazy, but they have imprisoned people for memes because they consider them copyrighted material, and they flat out imprison you for sharing a meme. They will imprison you for posts online. don't have many questions on this. There was a video I saw just last night, I showed Heather, of a teacher being arrested there while he's with a couple other teachers in a field trip with his students, and they're there with the other teachers, but he's being arrested because he wouldn't use the pronouns a student liked. So they are arresting the man and taking him to jail. This is the world they live in. This is the world we live in. America hasn't gotten this bad, thankfully. And hopefully we don't. Many in Britain were even visited over Thanksgiving weekend due to some posts that they shared. They shared them. They didn't write them, but the fact that they shared them means they agree, and they got visited by the cops. This is how it is there. Once that it was obvious that war supercharged an economy, well, it became business. It's the reality of it. War became business. And then it's another reason they can push their agendas. So you realize that if that's the case, then you would be stuck in a machine that perpetually churns out risks and wars to move along personal and public agendas. We've seen this. You can think I'm making it up. It's easy to prove. Both sides have done this. Here, the rider is on a red horse. What's that mean? Russia. No, not at all. Red is simply long associated with terrorism, and dread, and death. Long history of it. Satan and demons, what color? Usually red. Look at classic art. The Mask of the Red Death, an old poem. Red flags, the whole idea of a red flag. Right? Warning signs, red. Or the Red Terror in history that showed up several times throughout history. Red is also a symbol of blood, so it can be comfort when we associate it with Jesus. But usually, if you see blood, how do you react? Not comfort, right? You start bleeding, you're like, oh, something's wrong. So, red is always this way. It catches your attention. It's a warning. Notice this guy has a sword. Unlike the previous guy, this guy has a sword. It says a large or great one, but the word in Greek is makera. And here's a picture of that. Makera, it's a rusted old sword. That's what it looks like. It's got a curve to it. Good for chopping, cutting. It's where we get our machete from. Here's a machete. Nope, that's the wrong one. Different machete. Oops, my bad. Real machete, there we go. So, that's where that comes from. That's the sword he has. It's only about this long. So even though it says a great sword, it's really only about this long. It's just a weird translation thing. Verses 5 and 6. When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature, see, one creature per out of the four, saying, come. I looked, and behold, a black horse. And he who sat on him had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the four creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil or the wine. And this is an interesting one because what does everybody consider this one? The black horse is supposed to be famine. Okay. Now we see black actually associated with famine in the Bible. Jeremiah 14, 1 through 2, Lamentations 4, 4 through 8, and 5:10. To eat bread by weight, like it's talking about here, is an old Hebrew way of saying food is scarce. It's a Hebrew phrase. This does not have to be due to famine. It's just scarce for one reason or another. Food in many countries is scarce because the ruling class keeps people weak and under their thumb. It's true. In fact, do you know how often we send food to other countries? People are like, America should do more. We do more than anyone on the planet. But when we send the food, do you know what happens? It either gets hoarded, it gets locked down and left to go bad, or it gets burned right there at the bay. Many times in history. So that their people cannot eat, be healthy, and potentially rise up against them. which is odd because you think if you make them love them, if I make my people love me, I wouldn't rise up against them, right? If I treat them like crap, they're going to rise up against me. But whatever. We are the number one source of aid in the entire world, the United States, by far. Number one exporter, by far. People think China, it's not. It's just because we have all these Chinese products. But we are the number one exporter. Here, the phrase is chonix, or chenix, spelled like phoenix, but with a CH. Meaning, sorry, that would be conix, my bad. Meaning a measure of dry goods equal to a quart. It's a full day's work worth of wheat. We see this measure in the writings of Homer and Herodotus. And this was what was given to a soldier every day. This was the amount a soldier got to eat every day. This was his ration for the day. In the morning, here you go. And he split that up and ate it throughout the day. A denarius is a day's wage. So imagine, a day's worth of food costs an entire day's worth of work. So $10 an hour, 8 hours, $80. It costs you $80 to get 3 meals. So a definite price increase. Except, I think that's what it just about costs right now under Biden's Build Back Better plan. So I think it's around there, right? So we understand this concept of food becoming so expensive. There's no famine, guys, but everything costs more, doesn't it? It's amazing. But it seems like famine, but notice the oil and wine are not touched. This speaks to luxuries. The luxuries weren't hampered. They were not limited. Now, does that sound like a famine? If you had famine, you wouldn't have oil. You wouldn't have olives. You wouldn't have wine. You wouldn't have grapes. The oil and the wine are luxuries. So this is much more price inflation, rationing of lower classes, control. The higher cost items were not touched by the increase, so those with money aren't bothered by it. They can still buy what they want. It cost them a little more, but hey. Much more like recession. During the recession in 2008, we saw similar to this. We saw people losing jobs. No one trusted the economy enough to buy anything, which drove up prices, and people bought less. I would think you'd want to keep prices low to encourage people to keep buying, because once they see that, they're not going to buy. Whatever. Proves the point. People didn't spend on necessities, and cost increased. But what's interesting is video games did not. As an example, during that recession, video games did not take that much of a hit. They still sold as normal. It's a luxury. And it's a luxury most people allow themselves because it's an escape. Everything's bad, I need something to get me out of it. Whether it's books, movies, games, or alcohol, there's a luxury that you can allow yourself. Chocolate. But there's a luxury you can allow yourself every occasion. And this is what this is. So I don't see this as famine. We see the same scenario over and over again, even in our own history, in our own lives. This is a recession. Lastly, number 4, Revelation 6, 7 through 8. When the Lamb broke the 4th seal, I heard a voice of the living creature saying, "Come." And I looked and beheld an ashen horse. And he who sat on it was named Death. And Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by the wild beast of the earth. Now, we'll come back around to these guys, so if you think I'm going too fast, that's okay. In the description, we see it as pale. The Greek word is chloros, which means a pale, ghastly green. It's the root we get chlorine from. If you notice, chlorine has that kind of yellowish tint to it. This, in Leviticus, this color was the sign that they used when they translated. When I say this, it's because they translated in the Septuagint, right? So everything was Greek. So the Greeks used the exact same word in Leviticus when they talked about leprosy. This was the color of it. People got this pale, ghastly green. It's also the word in Mark 6:39 when Jesus says, "Sit here on the green grass." It wasn't that green. That was the word he used. Now notice there are two entities here. So there's not just 4 horsemen. There's 2 guys here. Death and hell. Death claims the body, but hell claims the soul. So we have a progression here with this set of a ruler who pushes peace, a loss of peace and a start of war, which leads to rationing, inflation to control, and then death due to pestilence, disease. John saw these horsemen going out like hunters, claiming their prey, armed with sword, pestilence, hunger, and instead of famine in the third, maybe more appropriately, despair at job and economy. And then even attacks by wild beasts. It's gotten so bad, the animals have to attack us. I've seen movies like that. This is actually found in Ezekiel 14:21. The Lord tells us, "For thus says the Lord God, how much more will I send my 4 severe judgments against Jerusalem? Sword, famine, wild beast, and plague, to cut off man and beast from it." Again, it's all found in the Old Testament. This is a punishment God warned would come. And here we see it coming to fruition. So, to wrap up for this week, to close, these 4, or maybe 5, horsemen come as the seals are broken. This is God's judgment upon a sinful world after his people are removed. But make no mistake, that does not mean God causes them. Most of the time in Revelation, if you look, all it is God removing his protection. The things that he stopped us from having, the natural consequences of our actions that he was holding back, he just stops holding back. He stops protecting. There's no one here to protect. So why? He removes his protection. But most of the time, God's judgment is not so direct as this. He just pulls back his protection. He holds back a lot. We don't appreciate that. He filters a lot for those he loves, those who are called according to his purposes. He gives you room to make a mistake and then repent. But if you refuse to do so, he lets you have your way. We see this with Pharaoh. God didn't harden his heart. He just let him have what he wanted. Pharaoh didn't want to let go. He relented, but his hardness of heart was his own fault. Over and over again, these people want what they want, and it doesn't matter that God's trying to keep you from it. You keep going after it. And God eventually says, all right, fine, if that's what you want. And we get what we want, but then we don't want it anymore. And he's like, I told you. You refused his rule. You decided your way was best. And you refused his guidance and his help. And people do this, and then they get mad at God when they get what they wanted. We walk away and we wonder why things aren't the way they were. We don't feel the comfort or the security or the blessing. And even if salvation is a one-sided covenant, which it is, the blessings are not. We have to walk after the Lord if we want to see him bless us, move in us, change us, and work things out for us. Now, most of this book is focused on the final 3.5 years, okay? Most of what you're going to read occurs in the final 3.5 years with references to things that span all 7. So like the Antichrist shows up at the beginning. He's there for all 7. But most of what we associate with the tribulation and we read about are in the final 3.5. You got to keep them straight. In that case, there's just a bad version of him that shows up later. This new leader shows up And he has a lot behind his back that he's hiding. He comes with peace. He promises welfare. He promises help. But behind his back, he has plans to cheat, murder, and steal from as many as possible. Who does that sound like? He steals the worst thing he can: hope. He leads them down that primrose path, and he convinces them that something that in all honesty they want to hear. Just like the people who just want what they want, these people want what he offers until they don't. Peter warns us that in the end, people will go to leaders just like that. They will go to the leaders that say the things they want to hear. That's why some congregations can be so popular, because they say the things people want to hear. Not the truth, but the things that confirm them. The leaders tell us what make us feel okay about our life and our choices. We want it that way anyway. And psychologically, we call this belief bias. You only look at what confirms your belief. You only want what confirms your bias. We look for proof that reinforces what we want, even if that proof is manipulated to do so. This new leader that we get to study in this new year lies that they don't need God. They don't need a savior. They can fight and push him off. He leads them away from truth, like so many of these so-called influencers do today. Instead of using their position to responsibly lead people to God, they lead them away. And he may do this, but remember, they hold the responsibility. They made the choice. Reading about these horsemen and thinking about these events can also be a bit scary, if you think about it. If you think too much about it, you can imagine this time, you can start to worry about being there or what it would be like. Start to stress about what's happening now, what's leading to it, right? We see all these little things setting up for it. Even though we're not going to be here for it. And that worry is not always a bad thing. There are two main types of worry: acute and chronic, psychologically. Acute worry is what happens on occasion. It's what leads us away from bad things. It's what warns us. It's when we worry that we feel like we're being followed, so we do something to protect ourselves. Or we worry that we're making the wrong decision, so we hold off on it and wait. Sometimes it can even save our lives. Acute worry is not the problem. Chronic worry is the problem. Chronic is the kind of worry that paralyzes us into inaction and indecisiveness. This is the worry we feel a lot of times in this country. You'd be surprised how many people in this room have ever dealt with anxiety or depression. Don't raise your hand, because it's pretty much everybody. That's common today. But this worry has a purpose. This worry should drive us to reach other people. This worry should drive us to make sure we're not here for it when the time comes, that we go in the rapture, but that we spread the gospel, and that we reach our coworkers and our friends and even our strangers. This is a new year, and in this new year, we should resolve, if nothing else, and actually keep this resolution, to do just that. We can use last year, for instance, as a testimony of what God has brought us through, what he's done, what we've watched him work in our favor, how he's healed us, how he's provided for us and protected us. And we can use this as an example of how great our God is and reach the world around us for him. So let's not forget this while we enjoy this week's festivities. Let's stand and sing.